I went to a billionaire murder party. And I can't believe what I saw. I'd been driving for what felt like hours, down the same long road, through the same long stretch of forest, when I finally arrived at my destination, a gargantuan mansion that sat atop a small hill. Surrounding it, like a moat encircling a castle, was a massive parking lot filled with luxury vehicles. But one vehicle in particular stood out from all the rest. A 1977 vintage cargo van that, despite being restored back to its original condition, had been emblazoned with the words "Best Friends Catering Company." Fucking Chad, I said out loud, as I parked my similarly depressing vehicle beside his. Despite the misleading company name, Chad was not my friend. If I'm being honest, I'd be surprised if he had any friends. He was my boss, and a unique form of asshole. I've been working for him for almost 4 years now, ever since my failed audition for that network procedural, when I was forced to find some sort of income to pay my rent. As much as he got on my nerves, in a way, I kind of felt sorry for him. This business was basically all he had, and I suppose, given his personality, that this catering teen was the closest thing he had to friends. It'll be fine, I told myself. It's just one gig, and then you're on vacation. No Chad for a couple of weeks. The inside of the mansion was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Almost all of the building's original walls must have been knocked down, resulting in what looked like some sort of weird open space bachelor pad the size of a football field, with tons of rich people stuff everywhere. Bearskin rugs, leather ottomans, an Olympic-size pool, and what appeared to be authentic medieval tapestries lining the walls. Must be nice, I thought to myself, enviously. Chad had hinted that the host of the party was James Alistair, a middle-aged billionaire, and famous for being one. He had formed and sold more successful companies than I'd had acting gigs, the most recent of which was supposedly planning to build a literal elevator to space. Even if they could do that, what would be the point? I wondered, as I headed into the kitchen, where the rest of the caterers were finishing up food prep. But before I could completely wallow in self-pity, a familiar voice greeted me at the door. Dan, I didn't know you were working tonight. Hey. Likewise, I replied with a smile, as I turned around to greet Sandy, my coworker and partner in crime, who, like all us lowly caterers, was donning a bow tie. Truth be told, I'd had a crush on her since my first day on the job, when we started sharing stories about funny mishaps we'd both had at music festivals. She was a budding screenwriter, and we always talked about our dream of working together. We'd always had a special connection, but I had somehow gone 4 years without building up the courage to ask her out. Maybe one day, I mused, optimistically. Why didn't you take the van in with us? She asked. I think you know the answer to that, I said, simultaneously winking at her and gesturing to Chad, who was unpacking water bottles behind me. He was 40-something, with a mustache as obnoxious as his vehicle. Answer to what? My boss interjected, as he always did. Speak of the devil, I mumbled, faking a smile. You're an hour late, Stevenson. Oh, am I? I didn't even realize. Chad stopped what he was doing and walked over to us, attempting to put his hand on my shoulder. I subtly maneuvered away so he couldn't reach me, as Sandy put her hand over her face, in an effort to hide her laughter. You know, Dan, Chad began, if you had taken the van in with us, you would have been on time. I've told you before that it makes a better impression on the host when we all roll out of the van together. It's more professional, and this is a business. And when one of us doesn't play their part, well, then we all look bad. You made us all look like dicks. You know what, Chad I began, before stopping myself. I'm actually missing out on serving a bunch of old rich people overpriced drinks at the cash bar. I better get over there. I smiled at Sandy, and she smiled back, as I silently walked away. And just remember. No fuck-ups tonight, Dan. Remember, they're paying triple tonight. We need to keep them happy. A few minutes later, I was standing behind the bar by myself, bored out of my mind, when an old lady in a fancy dress and a long necklace of pearls waddled over. Cosmopolitan, she commanded. You don't say? I thought to myself. Coming right up. But don't shake it too much. I wouldn't dare, I replied, while attempting a flirtatious smile. After making the drink and handing it back to her, she simply snatched it out of my grip and darted off. You're welcome. You know, there is a tip jar. And you are rich as sin. I mumbled quietly to myself as a silver-haired man in a suit stepped up to the bar. Hi, could I get a gin martini, please? I appreciated the pleasantry, so I spared him any sarcasm. Yes, sir. Sir? He laughed, just call me Jim. As I looked up, it took me a moment to recognize who he was. It was the billionaire himself, James Alistair. Of course. Right away. Mr. Jim. I stuttered, while wondering why I had added Mr. to his nickname. Just Jim is fine. And what's your name? Dan. Dan, huh? Dan's a good name. He said. Hey Dan, you see that guy over there? He pointed to the center of the room, where a large man with a walrus-like mustache and round, wire-frame glasses was laughing loudly with other guests. Yeah? I smiled. He loves ivory. Like real ivory, from elephant tusks. Collects it. What a fuckface. It took everything I had to avoid roaring with laughter. And that lady, Jim added, as he pointed to a brunette woman in a gold dress. Won't drink tap water. Literally has sparkling water running through the pipes in her estate. Despicable. What about that guy? I asked, trying not to laugh and playing along as I pointed to a tall, thin man with a long white beard and a bald head who was flailing his arms while conversing with his fellow aristocrats. Jim gave me a quizzical look and a cheeky smile. You tell me. What do you think that guy's deal is? Honestly. Maybe the worst of them all. Likes pineapples on his pizza. He immediately burst out laughing. Hey Dan, can I ask you a question? Yeah sure. Seriously. That ivory guy. You think he deserves to live in the lap of luxury? Oh, definitely not. I replied. You know. I agree with you. What a piece of shit. Jim said, before excusing himself, anyways, I'll be back. Was really good to meet you, Dan. You too, sir. I said, as he looked back at me with feigned frustration, I mean Jim. My correction put a huge smile on his face. He gave me a thumbs up as he walked away. I was just about to reflect on meeting possibly the coolest man on earth, when Chad dropped by and started chiding me for some napkins being out of alignment. I just had to grin and bear it. A short while later, my billionaire buddy returned, looking for a refill. You know, Dan, if I'm being honest, I kinda hate all of these people. He began with a smirk. Seriously, I despise each and every one of them. He surveyed the room, analyzing what must have been 100 or so regal-looking individuals, each of them joking and laughing quite obnoxiously. It was so deadpan and earnest that I couldn't help but laugh out loud. If you wanted any of them dead, he continued, any single one. Seriously, which one of these assholes would you kill? I didn't want to overstep any work or host boundaries, so I attempted to bow out of the conversation. Oh no, I'm sure they're all good people at heart. He smiled. Sure. But let's assume for a moment that they're not, and had it coming. Seriously, which one? Come on. He demanded with a smile. You know you've got someone in mind. Look, I'll start. I'd definitely kill that hedge fund douche over there. At that very moment, I saw Chad step out of the kitchen, barking orders at the staff. I mean, I guess my boss is an asshole. I answered as I pointed at Chad, shaking my head. That guy? He paused to study him. Yeah, he looks like an asshole. Okay, noted. See, not so hard, right? He asked, with a serious expression on his face, before stepping away. Anyways, Dan, I gotta go mingle and whatnot. Catch up with you in a bit, buddy. And like that, he was gone. What a character. I thought to myself, as my mind returned to Sandy, who was bartending at another table on the other side of the room. An hour or so later, as the party carried on, one of my coworkers passed by, with a confused look on his face. Hey, have you seen Chad? Who cares? I replied, guy's a dick. It's just a bit out of character for him, isn't it? To not be out here, you know, micromanaging us? Enjoy it while it lasts. Sandy quipped, as I made my way back to my bar. Not long after that, my good buddy, Jim, the billionaire host of the night's festivities, returned to the bar. Dan. Good news. Your boss. Not a problem anymore. Oh, and I'll have another martini. I laughed out loud. He got me again. This guy. I thought, as I began to make the martini. Sure thing, Jim. He simply stood there quietly, scanning the room, just as he had done during our last conversation. So who's next? I'm thinking Mrs. Wingate over there. Jim said, as he pointed back to the very same old lady with the pearl necklace who had failed to tip me earlier. Why her? I asked, genuinely curious. Honestly, she's a little bit racist. Like, she doesn't call anyone names or anything directly, but she kind of implies it. You think she deserves to go? Hell yeah. I said with a smile, once again playing along with our running gag. On it. He replied, giving me a thumbs up. I handed Jim his martini and, just as he was about to walk away, he turned back around, as though he'd forgotten to tell me something. Machete. I know you're thinking gun, but then innocent people get caught in the crossfire, so you know. Safety first, dot. He added, before turning back around and walking off. This actually happened 2 more times over the course of the night. Eventually, I ran out of ice, and headed to the kitchen in hopes that Sandy might be there. But instead, I found 2 of my co-workers arguing, in a panic. Where the heck is Chad? One of them yelled at the other, he never told us if the backyard is appetizers or light bites. I don't know. Haven't seen him. Does it matter? The other snapped back. Hey Dan, have you seen Chad? They both asked, in unison. Why does everyone give so many fucks about Chad? Just pick one. I don't know, we already served appetizers inside, so let's just go with light bites. I delegated, before remembering why I was there in the first place. Oh, ice. Where's the ice? In the basement. One of them sighed, pointing to a stairwell adjacent to the room. Thanks. I replied to the headless chickens, as I began to descend the staircase. Something I've always found curious is that no matter the home, basements always tend to be the same. Even this extravagant mansion was no different. Dimly lit and smelling of whatever that basement smell is. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I squinted in an effort to find the usual heap of ice bags we kept on hand for a variety of reasons. There they are. I said to myself as I spotted them. But as I headed to the back of the cellar, I discovered that they were being used for a very different reason. There, protruding from under the heap of ice bags, was an old lady's arm. Dangling from it, a long necklace of pearls. And below it, on the concrete, a dried puddle of blood. Oh fuck. It's Mrs. Wingate. And she wasn't the only one. Nearly everyone Jim had joked about lay under the ice, and there, at the bottom, was Chad. At that moment, a wave of panic rushed over me, as it all hit me. I began to pace back and forth, a million thoughts racing through my mind. This guy is actually killing his guests. I need to get out of here. Wait, no, what about Sandy? I need to get Sandy. No, don't be a hero. Call the police. Yes, that's it, call the police. I pulled out my cell phone and called the cops as fast as I could type those 3 numbers, while at the same time, looking up at the stairwell, to make sure no one was coming. Yes. My name is Dan Stevenson. I'm not sure exactly how to explain this, but I'm at some billionaire's party, and it appears that he is killing his guests. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? A woman replied. He's actually a famous guy, his name escaped me for a moment, until I found the words, James Alistair. Click. Just like that, she hung up. Huh? I looked at my cell phone service, but I had 5 bars. I called back immediately. Hi, this Dan Stevenson, I think our call dropped. I was just telling you about Dan, stop calling. We're not coming. The same woman said, in a deadpan manner. And then. Click. What the fuck, without any other option, I found myself back upstairs, searching for Sandy. But by the time I got to the reception area, everyone had moved outside to the massive lawn behind the house. Stepping out into the backyard, I scanned the crowd for my crush, while at the same time doing my best to stay calm and look normal. Eventually, I spotted her serving light bites on a tray, as she glided through the party. I ran up beside her, and leaned in. Sandy hey, what's up? She replied, distracted by a guest. I continued to walk alongside her, faking smiles and nods as we passed by the wealthy elite. There's something I need to tell you but just then, I felt a hand on my shoulder, followed by Jim's voice. Dan. Come over here. Hey Carl. Carl. You gotta meet Dan. He called out, as he guided me away from Sandy, and over to another area of the lawn. Hey. Said Carl, without making eye contact. He was a clean-shaven man, who looked about as nondescript as a rich guy could. This man makes the best gin martinis I've ever had. Jim continued, as he pointed at me. You gotta try one. Coming from him, I know that's a compliment. Carl replied. The man's had a lot of gin martinis. The 2 men each belted out a laugh as Carl stepped away. Watching him walk off, Jim moved closer to me and leaned in. Embezzled millions. He said, taking 2 of his fingers and making a slicing motion across his neck, with the same big, but now eerie, smile on his face. He winked and walked away. As soon as Jim was out of sight, I immediately returned to my search for Sandy, but she had disappeared. I ran over to one of my coworkers and attempted to explain what had happened, but stopped myself halfway through, as I could tell the tale was much too far-fetched to believe. I picked up a bottle of gin and immediately began chugging it, straight from the bottle. Thank God Chad wasn't here to see this shit. I thought to myself. Oh wait. Shit. My thoughts quickly returned to Jim and the bodies. I have to get out of here. I have to find Sandy. Finally, I spotted her not far away, and ran over to warn her again. Sandy, I've got to tell you something dash, but before I could continue, Jim let out a loud whistle at the center of the lawn, calling for his guests to join him. I walked over to get a closer look, as he raised his glass for a toast, to the crowd's applause. Thank you, thank you. No, please, please. He began, as the applause faded. I just wanted to say, that I'm so glad that you're all here today. I looked around at a sea of smiling faces. Because you're horrible humans. The crowd erupted in laughter. He waited for it to fade again, before continuing. No, seriously, you all deserve to die. And guess what? You're gonna. The group laughed even louder this time. Idiots. Just then, Jim searched the crowd and pointed at, of all people, me. Except for you. Not you, Dan. You're good people. The garden fell silent. Everyone turned around to look at me and, upon seeing that I was a mere caterer, simultaneously looked confused and laughed. Dan's a caterer, by the way. Oh, on that note. Dan, that girl, you like her, right? I mean, not to put you on the spot, but you've been eyeing her all night. I mean, come on. He was pointing at Sandy, who, standing beside me, gave me a weird, nervous look. Meanwhile, the group of caterers, long aware of my crush, rolled their eyes. Actually, Jim added, as he walked over to me, gesturing towards my co-workers. What about them, are they cool? I nodded, unable to think of what to say, before eventually spitting out a reply, yes. Yup, they're cool, Jim. I thought about running, but found my feet frozen in place. The billionaire moved his gaze over to a group of masked ushers, who had encircled the entire crowd of 1%ers. Okay, the caterers are cool. He yelled, waving his hand in the air to them, as whispers of confusion began emanating from the guests, now seeing the masked men. Leave the caterers alone. They're cool. But what was I saying? Oh, right. The rest of you are assholes though. You're all gonna die. Bottoms up. Jim continued, as he downed his glass of champagne in one gulp, and also. Goodbye. There was a deafening silence. And then. Utter chaos. Suddenly, the short fences that surrounded the distant perimeters of the yard began to rise up, as all of the masked ushers drew machetes and began to mow down the panicked guests. The shock was quickly replaced with screams and shrieks, as the lawn's once green grass soon resembled a red abstract expressionist painting, littered with bodies. Meanwhile, Jim simply stood there in the center of the garden. And don't even think about going back into the house. The doors and windows are all locked. Sandy and I turned to each other at the exact same time, a look of fear in both of our eyes. Run! I yelled, as we made a mad dash for the house, ignoring the billionaire's warning. As we entered the mansion and ran for the front door, we passed by many others who were being hacked to pieces, as they tried to do the same thing. But for some reason, no one stood in our way. We finally made it to the door, but just as Jim had warned, it was locked. Before we could even think about what to do next, a familiar voice called out. Dan! Why'd you run, man? I told you. You and your friends are good. I looked up and saw Jim standing there before us, smiling, and tried to fake a smile of my own. Hey. Jim, we were just dash and now I'm finding out you tried to call the cops? He interrupted me. My heart sank, as he stopped in front of us, holding a machete of his own. Sandy and I both backed up against the door, cowering in fear. It's cool, I guess. I mean. I'm hurt, but deep down, calling the cops. That just means you were trying to do right by your community, and that. See, that. Is why I like you, Dan. He walked over and patted me on the back. Think of it this way. You know how people always say, millionaires get away with murder? Well, then it stands to reason that billionaires get away with mass murder. He let out a self-satisfied chuckle, before holding out his hand. Dan, I told you. You, your girl, and all your catering buddies. You guys are all cool. Not knowing what to do, I simply closed my eyes and held out my hand, expecting him to machete my arm off. But all I felt was his hand shaking mine. I opened my eyes to find Jim smiling at Sandy and myself. Come, let me walk you guys out. He then looked over at one of the masked men and nodded. Click. The door opened, and Jim gestured for us to walk outside, putting his arms over both of our shoulders. As the billionaire escorted us through the parking lot, we passed by dozens of masked men rushing mops and body bags into the house. "That's your van over there, right?" Jim asked, ignoring the chaos all around us. "Oh wait, I know whose it is. Or should I say, whose it was. Geez, no wonder you hated that guy." I looked at him and forced one last smile, unable to utter any words. Sandy and I then turned around and started slowly walking to my car. "Anyways, it's been an absolute pleasure, Dan," he called out as he stood there and watched us walk down the long driveway to my car. "And seriously, don't be a stranger." We got in my car and immediately locked the doors. After sitting there in silence for a moment, Sandy put her hand on mine, both of us still shaking. I started the engine and drove the fuck off, Jim's silhouette still visible in the rearview mirror, waving goodbye in the distance.